Good evening all, and welcome back to Fear Knocks. Along the Oregon coast, the night changes the map. Fog slides across US 101, turnout bays lose their edges, and dune roads feel tighter than they look in daylight. After midnight, crews say the weather doesn't just hide things, it moves them. A warning cone stands alone in a cleared bay. A restroom door drifts open against its own spring. Headlights glow on a closed sand spur with no approach. And a calm voice gives a mile marker from a phone that hasn't worked in years. These accounts come from patrol logs, tow sheets, ranger notes, and marina calls taken under sodium lamps. One of the incidents in this set was nearly pulled from the archive. You'll recognize it when we get there. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And keep the bell on. We post every night. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Your comments help the channel grow. All right, let's get into it. I was a highway ranger, patrolling the coastal stretches of US 101. It was late autumn, a little past midnight, and the air held a sharp, damp chill. My headlights cut through the thick fog, revealing a single orange warning cone standing alone in an empty turnout bay. My routine patrols covered a long section of the Oregon coast, from the northern headlands down to the smaller fishing towns. This particular stretch was known for its dense coastal spruce forests and the occasional turnout bay, offering access to the dunes and the distant surf. My shift had started just after sunset, and the fog had rolled in steadily, thickening as the night progressed. I had driven this route hundreds of times, in all conditions. I knew every curve, every dip in the asphalt, every gravel shoulder. The isolation out here was profound, especially after midnight. The only sounds were the low hum of my patrol vehicle, the static hiss of the radio, and the distant, muffled roar of the Pacific. Earlier that evening, around dusk, I had personally checked and cleared this specific turnout bay. It was a wide, paved area, designed for trucks to pull off and rest, or for visitors to access a short trail leading to the beach. There had been a few recreational vehicles parked there then, but I had noted nothing out of the ordinary. My logbook entry confirmed the bay was clear of debris and hazards. I remembered the specific details of that check, the way the last light of the day had filtered through the dense forest canopy, the smell of salt and damp earth. Now, hours later, the bay was deserted, swallowed by the fog, save for that single, stark orange cone. I slowed the patrol vehicle, my headlights illuminating the cone more fully. It was a standard traffic cone, about 2 feet tall, bright orange with a reflective white band. It stood perfectly upright, centered in the middle of the empty bay, far from any parked car or work crew. There were no construction signs, no utility vehicles, no other cones. Just the one. My first thought was that a previous shift might have left it, but that seemed unlikely. We were meticulous about clearing equipment. The fog swirled around it, making it appear almost to float in the beam of my lights. I pulled the vehicle to the side of the highway, engaging the parking brake. The engine idled, a low, steady hum in the quiet night. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the passenger seat. The air outside was cold, barely above freezing, and the dampness immediately began to penetrate my uniform. I stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. The fog was thick, reducing visibility to only a few yards, and the distant surf was a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I walked slowly toward the cone, my flashlight beam cutting a tunnel through the swirling vapor. As I approached, I noticed something else. The pavement around the cone was dry, but there were faint scuff marks leading away from it. The scuff marks were distinct, not tire tracks, but impressions consistent with heavy boots, or perhaps a dragged object. They started near the cone and led directly toward the edge of the paved bay, where the dune grass began. I knelt, shining my light directly onto the asphalt. The marks were fresh, clearly made after the pavement had dried from the earlier coastal mist. They were not deep, but they were clear enough to follow. I stood up and began to trace their path, my flashlight beam sweeping ahead. The marks led in a relatively straight line, away from the highway, toward the dark mass of the dunes. The dune grass was thick and matted, covered in a fine layer of frost. The scuff marks continued here, pressing down the frozen blades, creating a narrow, disturbed trail. I moved cautiously, my senses heightened. The only sound was the soft rustle of my uniform and the occasional drip of moisture from the spruce branches overhead. The trail was easy to follow for about 20 feet, winding slightly through the low vegetation. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The ground here was different, a hard, wind-crusted sand, almost like packed snow, where the grass thinned out. There were no further marks. The trail simply ended. I swept my flashlight beam in a wide arc, searching for any continuation, any sign of disturbance. Nothing. The wind crust was unbroken, smooth and hard. It was as if whatever had made the marks had simply vanished at that point. I stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping into my bones, a strange sense of unease settling over me. The fog seemed to press in closer, muffling all sound, amplifying the silence. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the distinct feeling of being watched, though I saw nothing but the swirling fog and the dark shapes of the dunes. I took out my agency-issued camera and began to photograph the scene. I documented the cone, its position, and the scuff marks leading into the dune grass. I took multiple shots, trying to capture the subtle details in the low light. Each click of the shutter was sharp and clear in the oppressive quiet. I made sure to get wide shots and close-ups, capturing the abrupt end of the trail on the wind crust. My training kicked in, pushing aside the growing apprehension. I was gathering evidence, documenting an anomaly. This was procedural. After photographing everything, I walked back to the cone. I picked it up. It was just a cone, ordinary and inert. There was nothing unusual about its weight or texture. I placed it in the back of my patrol vehicle, securing it so it wouldn't roll around. I then returned to the spot where the scuff marks ended. I stood there for another minute, listening, watching the fog. The feeling of being observed persisted, a cold, silent presence just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I knew there was nothing more to find here, at least not visually. I got back into my vehicle, the interior feeling suddenly warmer, safer. I radioed dispatch, reporting the discovery of the cone and the unexplained scuff marks. My voice was calm, factual, as always. I described the location, the condition of the bay, and the details of the trail. Dispatch acknowledged, logging the incident. They advised me to continue my patrol and to file a full report upon returning to the station. The hum of the engine and the faint static of the radio were comforting sounds after the profound silence of the dunes. I pulled back onto the highway, leaving the empty, fog-shrouded turnout bay behind. The report I filed was detailed and precise. I included the photographs of the cone and the scuff marks. My supervisor reviewed it, and the incident was logged as an unexplained occurrence. There were no further leads, no missing persons reports in the area, no construction projects that could account for the cone. The file was eventually closed, marked as unresolved. The cone itself was cataloged and stored in the agency's evidence locker, a silent orange testament to an unknown event. I continued to patrol that stretch of highway for several more years. Each time I passed that specific turnout bay, I would glance over, half expecting to see something. The memory of the cold, the fog, and the abruptly ending trail never quite faded. I still think about it sometimes. The cone, the scuff marks, and the way they simply stopped on the hard wind crust, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist. I was working the night shift at the coastal rest area, performing my routine checks. It was late autumn, and a thick fog had rolled in, dropping the temperature significantly. I noticed a particular stall door in the men's restroom that seemed to drift open slightly, despite its closing spring. This was a small detail, easily dismissed during a quick pass-through. My job involved maintaining the facilities along a remote stretch of US 101, ensuring they remained clean and functional for travelers. The rest area was usually quiet after midnight, especially on weekdays. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the ocean were often the only constant companions. I had been on this route for a few years, and I knew the rhythm of the place well. Most nights were uneventful, a steady cycle of cleaning, restocking, and minor repairs. This particular night, however, felt different. The fog outside was so dense it swallowed the sound of passing headlights, creating an unusual sense of isolation. The air inside the restroom was cool, carrying a faint, metallic scent from the plumbing. I pushed the stall door shut, hearing the familiar creak of the spring. The mechanism felt solid. I continued my rounds, making a mental note of the minor adjustment. It was nothing to log in the maintenance sheet at that point. The silence of the night was profound, broken only by the distant, muffled whisper of the waves against the shore. My shift typically began just before sunset, lasting until dawn. The rest area was situated on a bluff overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by dense forest. The nearest town was about 20 miles north, a small fishing community. Most traffic consisted of long-haul truckers or late-night travelers making their way up or down the coast. I was responsible for both the men's and women's facilities, the picnic areas, and the small information kiosk. My vehicle was a standard utility truck, equipped with a radio for dispatch and a basic toolkit. I carried a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting through the pervasive fog that often blanketed this section of the highway. The routine was structured: check supplies, clean surfaces, empty waste bins, and address any immediate issues. I logged my activities in a facility logbook, noting any unusual occurrences or required repairs. The work was solitary, but I preferred it that way. It allowed for a quiet focus, a methodical approach to tasks. The sound of the ocean was a constant, sometimes a gentle whisper, sometimes a roaring presence. On nights like this, with the fog so thick, the world felt very small, confined to the immediate glow of the facility lights. About an hour later, after completing my exterior checks, I returned to the men's restroom. The air inside felt colder than before, a subtle chill that seemed to cling to the tile floor. I noticed the same stall door, the third one from the entrance, was again slightly ajar. It had drifted open by perhaps an inch or two, just enough to catch my eye. This was unusual. The spring on that door was relatively new, installed only a few months prior. It should have held the door firmly closed. I pushed it shut again, listening for any grinding or resistance in the mechanism. There was none. The spring creaked as it should, pulling the door closed with a firm snap. I made a mental note to check the hinge screws more thoroughly on my next pass. As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam swept across the floor. That's when I saw them. On the pale gray tiles, just inside the stall and extending a short distance into the main aisle, were footprints. They were distinct, made of fine, light-colored sand, the kind found on the nearby beach. The prints were small, not a large boot print, but something closer to a sneaker or a light shoe. They formed a tight, irregular circle within the stall itself, covering perhaps 6 or 7 tiles. What struck me immediately was their pattern. They didn't lead in or out of the stall in a straight line. Instead, they seemed to pace, turning back on themselves. There was no clear entry or exit path. The sand was dry, almost powdery, suggesting it had been there for some time, or that the source was dry. I knelt, touching one of the prints. The sand felt gritty under my finger. I looked around the rest of the floor. There were no other sandy prints anywhere else in the restroom. Not by the sinks, not by the entrance. Just these, confined to that small area around the third stall. It was perplexing. I had cleaned the floor thoroughly earlier in my shift. There should have been no sand. I took a quick photograph with my work phone, a standard procedure for documenting unusual conditions. I then swept the sand into a dustpan, leaving the floor spotless. I checked the stall door again, ensuring it was firmly latched. The spring held it tight. I continued my rounds, but the image of those footprints stayed with me. The way they circled, the lack of a clear path, it felt wrong. I checked the CCTV feed from the exterior cameras, but they only covered the parking lot and the building entrances. There was no interior coverage of the restrooms themselves, a privacy measure. I reviewed the footage from the last few hours. A few vehicles had stopped, mostly semi-trucks. Drivers would typically use the facilities and then leave within a few minutes. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary on the external feed. No one lingered. No one appeared to be carrying large amounts of sand. About an hour and a half later, the fog outside had grown even thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet. The air was barely above freezing. I decided to make another check of the men's restroom. As I approached the door, I could hear a faint, rhythmic creaking sound. It was the stall door. It was slowly drifting open again, the spring groaning softly with each movement. The sound was subtle, almost a whisper in the quiet space. I pushed the door shut, and it latched with a solid click. I then looked down at the floor. The footprints were back. They were in the exact same spot, within the same 6 or 7 tiles, forming the same tight, circular pattern. This time, however, they were slightly damp. The sand appeared darker, clinging to the tiles more firmly. It looked fresh, as if someone had just walked there. But the floor had been completely clean. I had swept it myself, and there was no one else in the restroom. I stood there for a long moment, my flashlight beam fixed on the prints. The cold in the room felt more pronounced, a damp chill that seemed to emanate from the floor itself. I checked the stall again. The door was still latched. I tried to pull it open without unlatching it, testing the spring. It held firm. Yet the prints were there. I documented the new prints with more photographs, noting the dampness in my facility log. This was beyond a simple maintenance issue. It felt like an impossible occurrence. I checked the water fixtures, looking for any leaks that might explain the dampness, but everything was dry. The sinks, the toilet, the floor around them, all dry. Only the sand prints were damp. I swept them up again, carefully, almost meticulously. I then decided to monitor the area more closely. I pulled up a small folding chair and sat just outside the restroom entrance, within earshot of the stall door. I kept my flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dim, ambient light from the parking lot. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, muffled roar of the ocean and the occasional drip of condensation from the roof. I waited. The minutes stretched, feeling much longer than they were. The cold seeped into my clothes. I listened intently, trying to discern any sound beyond the natural hum of the building. The static on my handheld radio was a low, constant presence. I thought about the isolation of the highway, the vast, dark forest behind the rest area. The fog outside was a solid wall, impenetrable to the headlights of passing vehicles. I considered calling dispatch, but what would I report? Unexplained footprints? A door that wouldn't stay shut? It sounded absurd, even to me. I focused on the task, on the observation. My breath plumed faintly in the cold air. After perhaps 20 minutes, I heard it again. The faint, slow creak of the stall door spring. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible movement, but distinct in the quiet. The sound was like a slow, deliberate sigh. I waited a few more seconds, letting the sound settle. Then, I slowly pushed the restroom door open and stepped inside. The third stall door was open by a few inches, and there, on the clean tiles, were the footprints. They were damp again, fresh sand, forming the same tight circle. It was as if someone had just walked there, turned around, and then vanished. There was no one. The restroom was empty. The air was still, cold, and heavy. I felt a profound sense of unease, a quiet dread that settled deep in my chest. I repeated the process. I swept the prints away, closed the door, and returned to my chair. This time, I kept my eyes fixed on the restroom entrance. No one entered or left. The parking lot remained empty. The fog pressed in, muffling all external sounds. The only light came from the distant highway lamps, diffused into a soft, eerie glow. I waited for a longer period, perhaps 40 minutes. The cold was biting now. My hands were stiff. The silence was absolute, save for my own breathing. Then, the creak began again. It was slower this time, a drawn-out groan from the spring. I stood up, moving quietly. I pushed the restroom door open. The stall door was open. The footprints were there, damp and fresh, circling in the same 6 tiles. This was not a prank. This was not a malfunction. This was something else entirely. The implication of an unseen presence, moving and leaving evidence, was deeply unsettling. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I took more photographs, my hands shaking slightly. The evidence was undeniable, yet completely inexplicable. I knew I had to report this fully. I made a detailed report in the facility log, attaching the photographs I had taken. I described the recurring footprints, their dampness, and the persistent drifting of the stall door. I noted the lack of any visible source for the sand or the moisture. My supervisor, a pragmatic individual, initially suggested it might be a prank by local teenagers or an issue with the plumbing. However, the CCTV footage showed no one lingering, and a plumber found no leaks. The maintenance crew checked the stall door spring and hinges, finding them in perfect working order. They even replaced the entire latch mechanism, but the problem persisted. The door would still slowly drift open, and the footprints would reappear. After a few more nights of this, the decision was made to close that specific stall for maintenance. A simple "out of order" sign was placed on it. The prints stopped appearing. The door, now locked from the inside, remained closed. The incident was filed away as an unexplained recurring anomaly in the facility log, a strange footnote in the operational history of the rest area. There was no official explanation, no logical conclusion. I still work the night shift on the coast. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the highway is quiet, I can almost hear that faint, slow creak of the stall door spring. I sometimes wonder what those footprints were doing, circling in that small space, and why they only appeared when the door drifted open. The memory of that cold, damp sand on the clean tiles remains with me, a quiet, unsettling presence in the isolation of the night. I was a state ranger patrolling the Oregon coast when the events began. It was a late autumn night, the air thick with a cold, damp fog rolling in from the Pacific. The first small irregularity was a distant glow on a road that should have been dark. My patrol route that night covered a stretch of the coastal highway and several access roads leading to the dunes. Most of these spurs were gated and locked after sunset, restricting vehicle access to protect the fragile ecosystem and prevent illegal camping. My job involved checking these gates, ensuring they were secure and logging any unusual activity. It was a solitary existence, often spent in the quiet hum of the patrol vehicle, the radio static a constant, low companion. The isolation was profound on nights like this, with the fog swallowing the highway and the forest edges. The specific location was a sand spur known as Osprey Point Access. It was a short, unpaved track, barely a quarter-mile long, ending at a small turnaround overlooking the dunes. A heavy steel gate, painted a faded forest green, blocked the entrance, secured with a robust chain and padlock. I had checked it earlier in my shift, around 9 o'clock, and confirmed it was locked tight. The logbook entry reflected this. The sand surface beyond the gate was typically undisturbed, showing only the old, washboard-like corduroy patterns from previous vehicle passes before the closure. I was heading back north on the highway, a little past midnight, when I first noticed it. My patrol vehicle was moving slowly, about 3 miles from the Osprey Point spur, the fog making visibility challenging. The air felt sharper, the temperature barely above freezing. Ahead, through the swirling mist, I saw a faint, diffuse light. It was not the steady, distant glow of a house or a street lamp. This light had a distinct, focused quality, like a beam cutting through the fog. It appeared to be coming from the direction of the closed spur. I slowed further, my gaze fixed on the anomaly. The light grew stronger, resolving into what looked unmistakably like a pair of headlights. They were low to the ground, a warm, yellowish hue, not the crisp white of modern LEDs. The beams seemed to be moving, very slowly, as if a vehicle was creeping along the sand track. I could not hear an engine, only the muted whisper of the fog and the distant, rhythmic crash of the surf. The silence was unsettling, given the apparent movement. My first thought was a trespasser. Someone had either cut the lock or found a way around the gate. This was not uncommon, though usually such activity involved a quick drive in and out, not a slow, deliberate crawl. I pulled my vehicle to the shoulder of the highway, killed my own headlights, and watched. The beams continued their slow progress, illuminating the fog ahead of them, creating a shimmering tunnel of light. They appeared to be nearing the turnaround at the end of the spur. I reached for my binoculars, a standard piece of equipment for night patrols. Through the lenses, the light became clearer, more defined. It was indeed a pair of headlights, perfectly aligned, casting long shadows of the low dune vegetation. The light was steady, unwavering, and seemed to emanate from a point just above the sand. I could not discern the outline of a vehicle, only the light itself, a concentrated glow moving through the thick air. The fog was dense enough to obscure details, but the light source was undeniable. Then, as the beams reached what I estimated to be the turnaround point, they simply faded. It was not an abrupt shutoff, but a gradual dimming, like a rheostat being turned down. The light softened, diffused, and then vanished completely, leaving the spur road in absolute darkness once more. The entire process, from first sighting to disappearance, had taken perhaps a few minutes. I lowered the binoculars, my breath held. The silence returned, heavier now, punctuated only by the distant ocean. There was no engine echo, no sound of doors closing, nothing to indicate a vehicle had stopped or departed. I started my engine and drove slowly to the entrance of the Osprey Point access spur. My own headlights cut through the fog, revealing the familiar green gate. It was still closed, the chain and padlock intact, exactly as I had left it hours earlier. There was no sign of forced entry, no fresh damage to the gate or the surrounding fence line. I parked my vehicle and stepped out, the cold air immediately biting at my exposed skin. The fog swirled around me, damp and heavy. I walked to the gate, shining my flashlight beam along the ground. The gravel leading up to the gate was undisturbed. Beyond the gate, the sand track stretched into the darkness. I scanned the area carefully, looking for any sign of a vehicle having bypassed the barrier. There were no tire tracks leading around the gate, no disturbed vegetation, no fresh ruts in the soft shoulder. It was as if nothing had passed. I unlocked the gate, swung it open, and drove my patrol vehicle a short distance onto the sand spur. I parked, leaving my headlights on, illuminating the track ahead. I got out again, this time with a more powerful handheld spotlight. I walked the entire length of the spur, my boots crunching softly on the sand. The corduroy pattern of the old tire lines was still visible, preserved by the lack of recent traffic. There were no fresh tracks, no new indentations in the sand. Nothing. The surface was smooth and undisturbed, save for the occasional imprint of a seabird or small mammal. I reached the turnaround at the end, shining my light across the small clearing and into the low dunes. There was nothing there. No vehicle, no debris, no sign of any recent presence. The fog was so thick I could barely see a few yards in any direction, but the spotlight cut through it, revealing only empty sand and sparse, wind-stunted vegetation. I walked back to my vehicle, my mind working through every possibility. Had I imagined it? The light had been too clear, too distinct. My binoculars had confirmed it. I returned to the gate, locked it securely, and made a detailed entry in my shift logbook. I described the sighting of the headlights, their slow movement, and their eventual disappearance. I noted the intact gate and the complete absence of fresh tracks on the sand spur. I also photographed the gate and the undisturbed sand beyond it using my patrol camera. The images, when reviewed later, showed only the fog and the gate, no anomalies. I radioed dispatch, reporting a possible trespasser at Osprey Point access, but also noting the lack of physical evidence. The dispatcher, accustomed to my factual reports, simply acknowledged the information and logged it. There was no follow-up, no further investigation. It was just another strange occurrence on a long night shift. The official file remained open but inactive. The incident left a quiet dread. I continued my patrols, but every time I passed the Osprey Point spur, I found myself glancing towards it, especially after dark. The memory of those slow, silent beams moving through the fog on a closed road stayed with me. It was a visual imprint, a moment of impossible observation that defied all logical explanation. I still think about those headlights sometimes. The way they moved, so deliberately, yet without a source, without a sound. The image of that glowing tunnel in the fog, leading to nowhere, remains clear in my mind. I worked the night shift as a dispatcher for the county sheriff's office. It was late autumn on the Oregon coast, and the air was often thick with fog and cold. One particular night, a routine transfer call took an unexpected turn. My station was a small windowless room, lit by the glow of monitors and the muted console lights. The only sounds were the low hum of the equipment and the occasional crackle of a distant radio transmission. Outside, the Pacific Highway, US 101, stretched north and south, a ribbon of asphalt winding through dense forest and along the rugged coastline. Most calls after midnight involved minor traffic incidents, a lost tourist, or the occasional domestic dispute in one of the small coastal towns. The isolation of the region meant that many calls came from payphones or older cell models with spotty reception. I had grown accustomed to the static and the faint whispers of the wind that often accompanied these calls. The rhythm of the night shift was predictable, a quiet vigil broken by brief bursts of activity. I had been doing this job for several years, and I prided myself on my calm demeanor and methodical approach to every situation. This particular evening had been quiet, even by our standards. A heavy fog had rolled in just after sunset, blanketing the highway and the surrounding forest in a dense, damp shroud. The temperature had dropped to barely above freezing, and I could almost feel the frost settling on the trees outside. Around an hour past midnight, a call came in on the non-emergency line. The caller sounded calm, his voice even, despite the faint static on the line. He reported a disabled vehicle, a dark sedan, pulled off into a turnout a few miles north of a specific landmark. He gave a precise mile marker number and mentioned the turnout by its informal local name, Whispering Pines. He stated he was calling from a payphone at that location. I began the standard procedure for a non-emergency roadside assistance request. I asked for his name, the make and model of his vehicle, and if anyone else was with him. He provided the details clearly, without hesitation. He was alone. His car had simply stopped running. He sounded resigned, not panicked. I started to log the information into the dispatch sheet, preparing to transfer him to the state police for a patrol car dispatch, as the location was outside our immediate jurisdiction for non-emergency calls. The state police handled most highway incidents. I informed him I would transfer him, and he acknowledged with a simple, "Thank you." I initiated the transfer. There was a brief click, a standard sound as the line connected to the other agency. Then, the caller's voice vanished. The line remained open, but all I could hear was a steady, low rush of wind. It was not the usual static or a dropped call. It was a clear, continuous sound, like a microphone left open in a strong breeze. I waited, listening intently. I called out his name, then, "Hello?" several times. There was no response, only the persistent, hollow sound of the wind. It was a sound I knew well from calls made near the ocean, but this was different. It felt too close, too direct, as if the handset itself was exposed to the elements. I held the line for a full minute, perhaps a little longer, before the system automatically disconnected. My initial thought was a dropped call, a common occurrence on the coast with its spotty cell service and aging landlines. But the nature of the sound, that sustained, clear wind, felt wrong. It was too clean for a simple disconnection. I checked the call record. The transfer had initiated successfully, but the state police had logged no incoming call. The system showed the line had been open on my end for about 90 seconds after the transfer attempt, then disconnected. I reviewed the details the caller had provided. The mile marker and the turnout name were precise. Whispering Pines was a known, albeit small, turnout on US 101, marked by a cluster of old-growth pines that often caught the wind in a distinct way. There was a single old payphone booth there, a relic from an earlier time, rarely used. A quiet unease settled over me. I decided to log the incident as unusual and requested a patrol unit to check the location. I contacted the nearest state police barracks and relayed the information. I emphasized the precise mile marker and the specific turnout. I also mentioned the payphone. A trooper was dispatched to investigate. The fog was still thick, limiting visibility to only a few car lengths, making travel slow and hazardous. I continued with my other duties, but the image of that payphone booth, isolated in the fog, stayed with me. The wind sound echoed in my mind. About an hour later, the trooper called in. He had located the turnout. There was no disabled vehicle, no dark sedan. The turnout was empty. He confirmed the presence of the payphone booth. He approached it, his voice calm over the radio, describing the scene. The booth itself was old, weathered, its glass fogged over. He reported that the handset was off the hook. It was dangling by its cord, swaying slightly in the damp, cold air. He checked the coin slot. There were no coins inside. He picked up the handset. He described the sound he heard through it, a steady, low rush of wind, exactly as I had heard it on my end. He confirmed it was the sound of the coastal wind, amplified and isolated by the phone's receiver. The trooper logged the payphone as found with the handset off the hook. He took a few photographs of the empty turnout and the phone booth. He checked the immediate vicinity, walking a short distance along the shoulder of the highway and into the edge of the forest, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense fog. He found no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had been there recently, apart from the phone itself. The ground was damp gravel and pine needles, which would have held impressions easily. The cold air was still and heavy, broken only by the distant sound of the surf and the whisper of the wind through the tall pines. He reported back that the scene was entirely devoid of any other evidence. There was nothing to suggest a person had been there, let alone vanished. I filed a detailed report, attaching the call record and the trooper's notes. The incident was marked as unexplained. There was no missing person report filed, as we had no name, only a voice. The state police considered it a prank call or a malfunction, despite the unusual circumstances. I knew it was more than that. The caller's voice had been too calm, too precise. The details he provided were accurate. The payphone handset, found off the hook, was a tangible piece of evidence that someone had indeed been there, using that phone, at that exact location. The wind sound, heard by both me and the trooper, linked the two ends of the event. The file was eventually closed. No further information ever surfaced. I continued my shifts, but the memory of that call lingered. I would often look at the map of US 101, tracing the route to the Whispering Pines turnout. The isolation of that stretch of highway, especially on a foggy night, felt different after that incident. It was no longer just a quiet road. It held a new, unsettling silence. Sometimes, late at night, when the dispatch room is quiet and the only sound is the hum of the console, I still hear it. I hear that steady, low rush of wind, clear and continuous, as if a line remains open somewhere out there, waiting. I manage a collection of rental cottages along a remote stretch of the Oregon coast. My shift often begins before dawn, checking system logs from my home office. One particular morning, a door sensor at the farthest property registered an unexpected activation. The air outside was still and cold, barely above freezing, even as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, muffling the usual roar of the ocean. The alarm notification was unusual for that specific cottage, which was currently unoccupied. It was a simple magnetic sensor, designed to detect the door opening. The log showed it had triggered, then reset, then triggered again a few minutes later. This was not a malfunction I recognized. My routine usually involved a quiet drive along the highway, checking on properties, ensuring everything was secure. The coastal region is known for its isolation, and these cottages are spread out, nestled among the dunes and sparse forest. Most issues are minor: a tripped breaker, a forgotten key, or a guest needing assistance. I keep a detailed logbook of all incidents, no matter how small. The work is mostly solitary, often under the cover of night or in the early morning hours, when the world feels hushed and still. I rely on the hum of my vehicle and the static of the radio for company. The cottage in question sat at the end of a long gravel access road, barely visible through the dense fog. It was a small, single-story structure, popular with guests seeking complete solitude. A narrow, sandy trail led directly from its back door over a low dune to the beach. I pulled my truck off the main highway and onto the gravel, my headlights cutting weak tunnels through the swirling mist. The drive took about 20 minutes, the crunch of the tires on the loose stones the only sound. I felt a slight unease, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. I parked a short distance from the cottage, leaving the engine running for warmth. The fog was so thick it seemed to absorb all sound, creating an unnatural silence. I grabbed my flashlight and the master key. The front door was secure, as expected. I walked around the side, my boots sinking slightly into the damp sand. The back door, the one facing the dune access, was also closed and locked. I checked the sensor itself. It appeared undisturbed, firmly attached to the doorframe and the door. There was no visible damage, no sign of forced entry. Then I noticed the sand. A thin, almost imperceptible glaze of fine, dry sand lay across the threshold, extending inward about a foot into the small entryway. It was as if something wide and flat had been pressed against the bottom of the door, pushing a small amount of sand inside. The sand was too fine to have been blown in by wind, especially with the door closed. It was a distinct, smooth layer. I knelt down, shining my flashlight across it. There were no footprints, no scuff marks, nothing to indicate a person or even an animal had moved through it. The sand was pristine, except for its presence inside. I took out my phone and captured several photographs of the sand glaze. I then carefully swept it away, making sure to document the process. I checked the door again, testing the lock and the sensor. Everything seemed to function correctly. I walked out to the dune path, following it for about 100 feet. The fog was even denser here, clinging to the sparse beach grass. The sand on the path was damp and undisturbed. There were no tracks of any kind, not even the faint impression of a shoe or a paw print past the first rise of the dune. It was as if whatever had pushed the sand inward had simply vanished into the fog. I returned to my truck, the quiet hum of the engine a welcome sound. I made a note in my logbook, detailing the sensor activation and the unusual sand. I attributed it to a possible sensor glitch, or perhaps a strong gust of wind that had somehow forced sand under the door, though the lack of prints bothered me. I drove back to my office, the incident filed away as an oddity. A few nights later, the same cottage registered another series of door alarms. This time, guests were staying there. My phone rang just after midnight. The guest, a woman, sounded shaken. She reported the back door alarm had chirped repeatedly, waking her and her partner. They had checked the door, found it locked, and seen nothing amiss. She mentioned a strange scratching sound, very faint, coming from the direction of the back door just before the alarm. It was like something dragging lightly across the wood. She described the fog as being particularly heavy that night, pressing against the windows. I dispatched a local maintenance worker, a man named Frank, to investigate. He arrived about an hour later, reporting the same thick fog. He found the back door secure. He also found a fresh, thin glaze of sand on the threshold, identical to what I had discovered. He took more photographs, confirming the lack of any discernible prints. The scratching sound the guest described was unsettling. Frank checked the exterior for any signs of disturbance, but found nothing. The sand on the dune path remained undisturbed. He reset the sensor and left, filing his report. The alarms continued sporadically over the next few weeks, always at the same cottage, always the back door, always in the early morning hours or late at night. Each time, a thin layer of sand would be found on the threshold, and each time, no prints. The guests grew increasingly unnerved. Some reported hearing the faint scratching sound, others just the sharp chirp of the alarm. One couple left early, citing an inability to sleep due to the constant alerts. They mentioned a feeling of being watched, a cold presence outside the door. I decided to involve the local sheriff's department. I compiled all the logbook entries, the guest reports, and the photographs of the sand. A deputy came out to the cottage. He walked the perimeter, checked the locks, and examined the dune path. He found nothing conclusive. He suggested it might be a persistent animal, perhaps a raccoon or a coyote, attempting to get inside, though he admitted the lack of prints was puzzling. He filed a brief report, noting no evidence of criminal activity. The case remained open but inactive. I installed a motion-activated camera facing the back door and the dune path. The camera recorded only fog, the occasional passing bird, or the wind rustling the beach grass. It never captured anything triggering the alarm or depositing the sand. The alarms, however, continued. The camera would record the door sensor light flashing, indicating an activation, but the footage would show nothing in front of the door. It was as if an invisible presence was interacting with the door, pushing sand inward, then retreating without a trace. The cold feeling reported by guests became a recurring detail. Eventually, I replaced the entire door and sensor system, hoping it was a faulty unit. The new system, however, registered the same unexplained activations. The sand glaze continued to appear. I stopped renting that particular cottage for a time, letting it sit empty. The alarms still triggered, even with no one inside. The logbook filled with entries, each one a testament to an unseen, persistent disturbance. The isolation of the place seemed to deepen, the forest and dunes holding a secret I could not uncover. The cottage remains part of our inventory, though it is rarely booked. I still receive the occasional alarm notification from its backdoor sensor. The sand glaze still appears on the threshold, a fine, silent testament to something that approaches from the dunes. The local sheriff's file on the property is thin, marked unexplained. I sometimes drive past the cottage late at night, seeing its dark windows through the fog. I wonder what presses against that door, what leaves the sand, and why it never leaves a mark. I still hear the faint, almost imperceptible scratch in my memory, a sound that seems to whisper from the edge of the world. I worked the night shift for a towing service along the Oregon coast. It was late autumn, and the air carried the damp chill of the Pacific, thick with coastal fog. My dispatch radio crackled with a report of a stalled vehicle, an older coupe, completely dark on a remote stretch of highway. The call came in just past midnight, a single-car incident reported by a passing motorist. The location was a winding 2-lane road, barely more than a trail, deep within the spruce forest. This particular stretch was known for its isolation, a place where cell service often dropped out entirely. The report mentioned the car was dark, no lights visible, which was unusual for a breakdown on a highway shoulder. I confirmed the details with dispatch, the make and model of the coupe, and its approximate mileage marker. The fog was already heavy, pressing against the windshield as I drove out of town. My headlights cut weak paths through the swirling vapor, illuminating the dense wall of pine and spruce trees lining the road. The silence outside the truck was profound, broken only by the hum of my engine and the occasional static from the radio. My job involved responding to everything from minor fender benders to serious accidents, often in the dead of night. The Oregon coast could be unforgiving, especially during the colder months. Fog was a constant companion, sometimes so dense it felt like driving through milk. I knew these roads intimately. Every curve, every dip, every stretch of gravel shoulder. Most calls were straightforward. A flat tire, an empty fuel tank, an engine overheating. People often broke down far from any town, sometimes after dark. I carried a full toolkit, a multimeter, and a powerful spotlight. Safety was paramount, especially on the highway. I always activated my truck's amber warning lights, and I expected other drivers to do the same. It was standard procedure, a basic precaution against the low visibility and the fast-moving traffic. The isolation of the forest roads meant I often worked alone, sometimes for hours, before another vehicle passed. This particular night felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones despite the truck's heater. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a familiar scent of the coastal forest. I located the coupe about 3 miles past the last turnoff, exactly where dispatch had indicated. It was a dark blue, older model, pulled onto the narrow shoulder. The vehicle was completely dark, just as the report stated. No hazard lights flashed. No interior dome light glowed. The fog was thickest here, muffling all sound, making the forest feel even more oppressive. I parked my tow truck a safe distance behind the coupe, activating my own warning lights. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my toolkit, then approached the car cautiously. The air was still, barely above freezing, and a thin layer of frost had begun to form on the car's windows. I circled the vehicle, checking for any visible damage. There was none. No dents, no scrapes, no broken glass. It looked as if someone had simply parked it there and walked away. I tried the driver's side door handle. It was unlocked. This was not uncommon. Some people left their cars unlocked, hoping to retrieve items later. I opened the door and shined my light into the cabin. The interior was tidy, no trash or personal effects scattered about. The keys were not in the ignition. I checked the glove compartment and under the seats, but found nothing. A strange odor hung in the air inside the car, a faint but distinct smell. It reminded me of wet rope, or perhaps old damp canvas, a scent I couldn't quite place in this context. It was not the usual smell of stale coffee or old fast food that often lingered in abandoned vehicles. I leaned in closer, trying to identify it more precisely, but it remained elusive, just that odd, earthy, wet fiber smell. I reached for the hazard light switch on the dashboard, I pressed it firmly. Nothing happened. No click, no flash, no indication of power. This was puzzling. Even with a dead engine, the battery should still power the hazard lights. I retrieved my multimeter from the truck. I popped the hood of the coupe. The engine bay was cold to the touch, completely cold, as if the car had been sitting there for hours, not just stalled a few minutes ago. There was no residual warmth, no lingering heat from a recently running engine. I connected the multimeter to the battery terminals. The reading was strong, a healthy 12.6 volts. The battery was fully charged, perfectly capable of powering the car's electrical systems, including the hazard lights. I checked the fuses, one by one, using my test light. All were intact, no blown fuses. I tried the headlights, the radio, the interior lights. Nothing. It was as if the entire electrical system, despite a healthy battery, was completely inert. The car was a dark, cold shell. The only sound was the distant hum of my tow truck and the whisper of the wind through the spruce branches. I stood there for a moment, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog, illuminating the silent, dark car. The wet rope smell seemed to intensify slightly, a subtle presence in the cold air. I rechecked my connections, then the multimeter itself. Everything was functioning correctly. The car simply refused to respond. I tried to start the engine, turning the key in the ignition, but there was no crank, no click, no sound at all. It was completely dead, despite the full battery. This was highly unusual. A car with a healthy battery and no blown fuses should at least attempt to crank, or at minimum, power the accessory systems. I considered the possibility of a main ground fault, but even then, some residual power usually remained. This car was utterly inert. I walked back to my truck, radioing dispatch. I reported the situation, explaining the healthy battery and the complete lack of electrical response. Dispatch logged the details, noting the anomaly. They confirmed the owner had not yet been reached. I decided to prepare the coupe for towing. I needed to get it off the highway shoulder and back to the shop. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to only a few car lengths. I hooked up the car to the tow truck, securing it carefully. As I worked, the silence of the forest pressed in. There were no animal sounds, no distant traffic, just the soft crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional drip of moisture from the spruce branches. I took a few photographs of the scene for my logbook, documenting the car's position and condition. The cold was persistent, and the wet rope smell seemed to cling to my clothes after being inside the car. I made sure all my warning lights were fully visible, a beacon in the dense fog. Before leaving, I did one final check of the coupe. I opened the driver's door again, shining my light into the cabin. The wet rope smell was still there, faint but undeniable. I ran my hand over the dashboard, the seats, the steering wheel. Everything felt dry, cool to the touch. There was no visible source for the odor. It was just there. I closed the door, the sound echoing softly in the quiet night. I double-checked the tow straps, ensuring the car was secure. The whole incident felt off, a small but persistent irregularity that defied my usual diagnostic procedures. I had towed hundreds of cars, but I had never encountered one with a fully charged battery that was so completely unresponsive, especially with no apparent cause. The lack of hazard lights was the most unsettling detail. It was a basic safety feature, almost always functional unless the battery was completely drained or the system catastrophically failed. Neither seemed to be the case here. I got back into my truck, the warmth of the cabin a welcome relief from the cold, damp night. I started the drive back to the shop, the dark coupe trailing silently behind me through the fog. I dropped the coupe off at the shop lot, making sure it was secured. I filled out my report, detailing the healthy battery, the cold engine, and the complete lack of electrical function. I also noted the unusual smell in the cabin. The next morning, the owner of the coupe arrived at the shop. He was a man in his late 50s, looking tired and a little confused. He explained he had been driving home late the previous night when his car had simply died. He said he had pulled over, tried to restart it, but nothing happened. He had then walked a considerable distance to find cell service and call for a tow. He seemed relieved to see his car. As he was signing the paperwork, he paused. He looked at me, then back at his car. He asked, "Why weren't the hazard lights on? I thought I left them flashing." I told him they had been completely dark when I arrived, and I couldn't get them to activate. He frowned, a deep line appearing between his brows. He insisted he had pressed the hazard switch before leaving the vehicle. He seemed genuinely puzzled, almost disturbed by the fact they had not been on. I simply reiterated what I had found. The mechanic later confirmed the car's electrical system was completely dead, despite the healthy battery, and found no obvious fault. The mechanic eventually found a deeply corroded main ground wire, hidden beneath layers of grime, which explained the electrical failure. It was a plausible explanation, yet it did not account for everything. It did not explain the owner's insistence about the hazard lights. It did not explain the engine being completely cold after only a short time. And it certainly did not explain the persistent, faint smell of wet rope inside the cabin. I still think about that night sometimes. The silence in the spruce forest, the dark car, and the owner's quiet question. The memory of that smell in particular occasionally resurfaces, a subtle, unsettling presence. I was the lead on a highway paint crew, marking new lane guides along a stretch of coastal road. It was late autumn, a cold night with a thick fog rolling in from the Pacific. We found the first chalk mark a little past midnight, a small arrow drawn directly behind our fresh white line. Our work involved precise measurements and careful application. We followed detailed lane plans, using specialized equipment to lay down reflective paint. The process was methodical, requiring focus and coordination, especially during the night shifts when visibility was often poor. We worked a remote section of highway, a two-lane road that wound through dense forest on one side and opened to marshland and the ocean on the other. The air always carried the scent of salt and damp earth. The hum of our paint truck and the generator was a constant presence, a familiar sound in the isolation. We were accustomed to the quiet of the night, broken only by the distant crash of waves or the croaking of marsh frogs. Our routine was established, a rhythm of setting cones, applying paint, and clearing the area. Every detail was accounted for, every mark on the road part of a larger, carefully planned design. This particular stretch was known for its persistent fog, which often reduced visibility to a few car lengths. We relied on our bright headlights and the reflective properties of the fresh paint to guide us. The first arrow was small, barely an inch long, a simple V shape drawn in white chalk. It was positioned directly on the asphalt, just behind the freshly painted solid white line we had just laid down. My crew member, Mark, pointed it out. He thought it was a prank, maybe from a previous shift, though it was unusual to find such a mark. Our lane plan showed no such indicators. I knelt down, running a gloved finger over the chalk. It felt fresh, not weathered. The arrow pointed away from the direction of traffic flow, back towards the ocean, which was a few miles behind us. We were working inland, away from the coast. I made a mental note, dismissing it as an oddity. We continued our work, moving further down the highway, the fog growing denser around us. The air grew colder, the dampness seeping into our gear. A few minutes later, as we prepared for the next section, another arrow appeared. This one was identical, Same size, same chalk, same backward orientation. It was behind our new paint, exactly where we had just finished. This was no longer a random occurrence. I called the crew together. We checked the immediate area, sweeping our powerful work lights across the asphalt and the gravel shoulder. There was nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, no sign of anyone else. The only sounds were the distant ocean and the persistent low croak of the marsh frogs. The fog swirled, making the beam of our headlights diffuse and hazy. We were miles from any town, deep in the forest. The isolation felt more pronounced now. We continued, more alert this time. The next arrow appeared after another section of paint was laid. It was the third one. The pattern was clear. Each arrow appeared after we had completed a segment of road, always behind our fresh paint, always pointing back towards the ocean. The chalk was always white, the same as our road marking chalk. We had not used any chalk on this shift. We used a laser guidance system and a string line for alignment, not chalk. I checked our supply of chalk, which was stored in a sealed container in the truck. It was untouched. The thought of someone following us, drawing these marks in the dense fog, was unsettling. We were moving at a steady pace, our equipment loud. It seemed impossible for someone to be so close without being detected. I instructed the crew to keep a sharp lookout. We worked in pairs, one operating the machine, the other spotting and setting cones. The fog was so thick now that the visibility was reduced to perhaps a dozen feet. Our radio crackled with static, making communication with dispatch difficult. The air was barely above freezing, and the dampness clung to everything. We found a fourth arrow, then a fifth. Each time, the discovery was met with a growing sense of unease. The arrows were not random. They were deliberate, placed with a strange precision. They were not pointing towards the ocean as a general direction, but specifically back along the path we had just painted, as if marking a reverse route. I decided we needed to document this. I pulled out my phone and took a photograph of one of the arrows, trying to capture its exact placement relative to our fresh paint. The low light and fog made the image grainy, but the chalk mark was visible. I also made a detailed entry in our logbook, noting the time and location of each discovery. We were about 3 miles into our shift, and the arrows had appeared consistently. The crew was quiet, their usual banter replaced by a focused silence. The hum of the machinery felt less comforting now, more like a beacon in the vast darkness. The forest pressed in on one side, a wall of black trees, while the marsh stretched out on the other, an unseen expanse from which the frog calls seemed to emanate. We finished our assigned section of highway just before dawn. The last arrow was found near the end of our route, bringing the total to about a dozen. Each one was a small, silent testament to something inexplicable. We packed up our equipment, the first hint of gray light beginning to pierce the thick fog. The air was still heavy with moisture, and a thin layer of frost covered the grass along the shoulder. I felt a strange compulsion to retrace our steps, to see if the arrows were still there. It was against protocol to linger, but the mystery was too strong. I drove the lead truck slowly back along the newly painted highway, my headlights cutting through the lingering fog. As the light improved, I began to spot them. The arrows were still there, but they had changed. The crisp white chalk marks were now smeared. Each arrow was elongated, stretched and blurred, as if something had dragged across them. The smearing was not random. It consistently pulled the chalk towards the marsh side of the road. It looked like something had moved from the center line, across the arrow, and off towards the marsh. The pattern was uniform. Every single arrow smeared in the same direction. There were no footprints in the soft shoulder, no tracks in the gravel. The ground was damp, but undisturbed. The marsh itself was a tangle of reeds and shallow water, not easily traversable. I stopped the truck and got out, walking back to examine a few of the smeared marks more closely. The chalk was definitely pulled towards the marsh. It was not a natural smearing from vehicle tires, which would have been more erratic. This was a deliberate, consistent drag. The cold air felt sharper now, carrying a faint, earthy smell from the marsh. The quiet dread I had felt earlier intensified. I took more photographs, documenting the smeared chalk. The crew members who followed me also noticed the change. They were as perplexed as I was. We discussed possibilities. An animal, perhaps a large bird, but the consistency of the smearing seemed to rule that out. A person would have left tracks. I filed a detailed report with our dispatch office, including the photographs and the logbook entries. I described the initial discovery of the arrows and their strange, backward orientation. I then detailed the subsequent smearing, emphasizing its consistent direction towards the marsh. The dispatcher listened calmly, noting down the information. She said she would pass it on to local law enforcement, but she sounded skeptical. There was no damage to property, no clear evidence of trespass, just chalk marks. The incident was logged as an unexplained occurrence in the official file. No one from law enforcement ever followed up directly with me. The report likely sat in a file, an oddity among more pressing matters. We never found out who or what made those marks, or what smeared them. The highway section was completed, and we moved on to other projects. I still think about those arrows sometimes, especially when the fog rolls in thick along the coast. The image of those small, white V's pointing back into the darkness, then smeared towards the unseen marsh, remains clear in my mind. The quiet hum of the paint truck, the cold air, the distant sound of the ocean, they all bring it back. I was a contract cyclist for the Oregon State Highway Department. My job involved routine inspections of coastal infrastructure. It was late autumn, well past midnight, and the air carried a sharp, damp chill. A thick fog had begun to roll in from the Pacific. I noticed the first irregularity about halfway across the old steel bridge. My route that night covered a stretch of Highway 101, specifically targeting the older, more remote bridges. These structures required close visual inspection, something a vehicle could not provide as effectively. My bicycle was equipped with a powerful headlight, a two-way radio, and a basic camera for documentation. The work was solitary, often cold, and usually uneventful. I preferred the night shifts. The highway was quiet, and the only sounds were the ocean and the occasional distant truck. I had been doing this for about 3 years, covering hundreds of miles of the Oregon coast. The routine was ingrained. Check the expansion joints, look for corrosion, photograph any cracks or unusual wear. This particular bridge was a long steel grate structure, spanning a wide, dark inlet where the river met the sea. The constant drone of the water below was a familiar sound. The fog had been a slow creep, starting as a low haze over the water, then gradually thickening until it swallowed the distant forest line. My headlight cut a tunnel through the swirling vapor, illuminating the wet steel grate directly in front of my wheel. The metal was slick with condensation, a fine sheen of moisture covering every surface. That was why the prints stood out so starkly. They were barefoot, clearly defined, and completely dry. They were set neatly, one after the other, along the center of the grate. The pattern was consistent, a steady walking pace. I stopped my bike, the tires hissing softly on the damp metal. The only sound was the low hum of the bridge and the distant, muffled roar of the ocean. I dismounted, pushing my bicycle slowly forward. The prints continued, each one a perfect, dry impression on the wet steel. There was no water inside the outlines, no smudging, just the clear, undisturbed texture of skin against metal. The air felt colder now, a damp chill seeping into my gear. I knelt, examining the first few prints. They were small, not a child's, but certainly not a large adult's either. The arches were distinct, the toes clearly separated. It was as if someone had walked across the bridge with perfectly dry feet, leaving no moisture behind, despite the pervasive dampness. I took out my camera, a small, rugged device, and began to photograph each print, moving slowly along the center line of the bridge. The fog was growing denser, wrapping around me, reducing visibility to only a few yards. The prints continued for a considerable distance, perhaps 100 yards or more, always in the exact center of the grate. There was no deviation, no sign of hesitation. Then, about 2/3 of the way across the span, the pattern changed. The prints veered sharply to the right, moving directly towards the bridge rail. They continued in a straight line, maintaining the same dry, precise quality, until they reached the very edge of the steel grate, right where the rail began. There, the prints simply stopped. There was no scuff mark, no drag, no indication of a slip or a fall. They ended cleanly, as if the person had simply stepped off the bridge into the thick, swirling fog. I leaned over the rail, peering down into the darkness. The water below was invisible, swallowed by the night and the fog. I listened intently, straining to hear anything over the water's drone. There was no splash, no echo, no sound at all from the depths. Only the cold whisper of the wind through the steel. I stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping into my bones. The situation made no sense. Someone had walked across a wet bridge, leaving dry prints, and then vanished. I checked my radio. The static was a constant companion on this stretch of highway, but I could usually get through to dispatch. I pressed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I'm on the Big Creek Bridge, westbound lane. I have an unusual situation to report." The voice from dispatch was calm, accustomed to late-night calls. "Go ahead, Unit 7. I described what I had found, the dry prints, their path, and their abrupt end at the rail. I emphasized the lack of any other evidence. No shoes, no clothing, no sound. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Understood, Unit 7. Stay on scene. We're sending a unit to your location. Estimated arrival in about 20 minutes. I continued to photograph the prints, documenting their exact position relative to the bridge structure. The fog was now so thick that my headlight barely penetrated it. I could feel the isolation pressing in. The bridge felt different, no longer just a structure, but a place where something impossible had occurred. I kept my radio close, listening to the occasional crackle of static. After what felt like a much longer time, I saw the faint glow of headlights approaching through the fog. A patrol car from the Oregon State Police pulled up behind my bicycle, its emergency lights a muted pulse in the dense air. An officer emerged, a tall figure in a heavy coat, his breath pluming in the cold. I walked him through my findings, pointing out the dry prints, explaining the anomaly of their dryness on the wet grate. He knelt, examining them closely, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. He didn't say much, his expression unreadable. He took his own set of photographs, then radioed his own dispatch. A few minutes later, another patrol car arrived, followed by a vehicle from the county sheriff's department. The bridge became a quiet scene of investigation. More lights appeared, illuminating the section where the prints ended. Officers leaned over the rail, their flashlights probing the darkness below. But the fog and the night swallowed all light. They found nothing. No sign of a fall, no debris on the water, no indication of a person. The investigation continued for several hours. They brought in a small boat, but the fog was too thick and the currents too strong to conduct a thorough search below the bridge. My photographs were collected as evidence. I provided a detailed report describing every observation, every procedural step I had taken. The officers were professional, but their quiet demeanor conveyed a shared sense of bewilderment. There was no logical explanation for the dry prints on the wet steel, nor for the complete disappearance of the person who made them. The incident was logged, a file opened, but without a body or any further evidence, it quickly became a cold case. I was told to continue my patrol, to report anything else unusual. I finished my shift, the memory of those dry prints etched into my mind. The official logbook entry was brief, noting an unexplained incident and lack of evidence. There was no resolution, no closure. The bridge remained, the fog continued its seasonal cycle, and the ocean still roared below. Sometimes, when I am on a similar bridge at night, the fog rolling in, I still hear the low hum of the steel and the distant drone of the water. I remember the precise pattern of those dry prints and the way they simply ended at the rail, leading into nothing. I was a security officer, assigned to patrol the turnout bays along a stretch of US 101. It was a late autumn night, the air barely above freezing, and a thick fog had rolled in from the Pacific. My first irregularity appeared as a faded camper trailer, parked deep in a bay that was usually empty. My routine involved checking these isolated turnouts every few hours. I looked for abandoned vehicles, illegal camping, or any signs of trouble. The Oregon Coast Highway could be a lonely place after dark, especially when the fog was heavy. Most nights were quiet, marked only by the hiss of my tires on the wet asphalt and the static of the radio. I logged each vehicle, noted its condition, and checked for permits. The job was mostly about presence, a deterrent against minor infractions or worse. This particular turnout was a long, gravel-filled bay, tucked away from the main highway by a dense line of pines. Headlights from passing cars were muffled by the fog, appearing as faint glows before vanishing. The camper was an older model, a small travel trailer, its paint faded to a dull cream color. It sat at an odd angle, not quite centered in the parking space. My removal sheet listed it for tagging. It had been reported as stationary for longer than permitted. I pulled my patrol vehicle alongside, the gravel crunching under the tires. The engine hummed softly as I cut the lights, letting the fog and the darkness settle around me. I stepped out into the cold, the damp air immediately chilling my face. The fog was so thick it seemed to absorb all sound, creating an unnatural quiet. I walked slowly towards the camper, my flashlight beam cutting through the mist. The trailer looked neglected. There was no sign of recent activity around it, no footprints in the damp gravel, no fresh litter. I tapped lightly on the door, then a bit firmer, calling out a standard greeting. There was no response. I tried the windows, peering through the grimy glass, but the interior was dark and obscured. I circled the trailer, checking the tires, the hitch, and the license plate. The plate was current, but the registration sticker looked old. I returned to the door, a small metal latch on the side. I tried the handle. It turned easily, and the door clicked open with a soft sound. This was unusual. Most campers left unattended were secured. I hesitated for a moment, the cold seeping into my gloves. My training dictated caution. I announced myself again, clearly stating my position and purpose. Still, only silence answered me. I reached for my body camera, activating it with a click, the small red light confirming it was recording. I pushed the door open further, stepping inside. The air inside the camper was still, a faint, stale odor hanging in the small space. My flashlight beam swept across a compact kitchen area, a small dinette, and a sleeping berth. Everything was tidy, almost unnaturally so. There were no clothes strewn about, no dishes in the sink, no personal items visible. It looked as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. I checked the stove. The knobs were all in the off position, cold to the touch. Then I moved to the sink. I reached out, turning the faucet. No water came out. I tried the other faucet. Still nothing. I noticed a small, damp rag folded neatly on the counter beside the sink, almost like a flag. I picked it up. It was cool, but not cold. Curiosity, or perhaps a growing unease, prompted me to check the sink basin itself. I reached in, my fingers brushing against the porcelain. The water in the drain trap was distinctly warm. Not hot, but warm to the wrist, as if someone had just finished washing their hands or a small item. I pulled out my small digital thermometer. I held it against the wet surface of the drain, waiting for the reading. It settled on a temperature a few degrees above what the ambient air inside the camper felt. This was the first real anomaly. The stove was off, the camper was cold, but the sink had held residual warmth. I took a few photographs with my camera, documenting the rag, the sink, and the thermometer reading. I moved through the rest of the small cabin, my flashlight beam methodically sweeping every surface. The bed was made, the blankets smooth. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no disarray. It was as if the occupant had simply vanished, leaving behind only the ghost of warmth in the sink. The isolation of the highway and the thick fog outside pressed in on me. The quiet dread began to settle. I stepped back outside, pulling the door shut but not latching it. The cold air felt sharper now, a stark contrast to the inexplicable warmth I had just encountered. I returned to my patrol vehicle and contacted dispatch. My voice was calm, procedural, but I could feel a subtle tension in my shoulders. I reported the abandoned camper, the open door, and the unusual detail of the warm sink water. Dispatch acknowledged, confirming they would send a deputy from the sheriff's department. The wait felt longer than usual. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows of my vehicle. I kept my headlights off, preferring the darkness and the limited visibility of my own flashlight. The radio crackled occasionally, a burst of static, then silence. While I waited, I reviewed the information on the removal sheet. It indicated the camper had been reported by a local storage lot owner. The registration on file showed a lapsed payment for several months. The owner's last known address was an old post office box in a town a few miles inland. There was no contact number listed. This was not uncommon for older, less maintained vehicles, but combined with the warm sink, it felt different. I stepped out again, walking around the camper one more time. I checked for any signs of a recent campfire, a discarded food wrapper, anything that might suggest a temporary occupant. There was nothing. The gravel around the camper was undisturbed, save for my own footprints. After what felt like a long time, I saw the faint glow of approaching headlights through the fog. A patrol vehicle from the sheriff's department slowly pulled into the turnout. Deputy Miller stepped out, his face grim in the beam of his flashlight. I briefed him on the situation, detailing my observations, especially the warm water and the folded rag. He listened carefully, his expression unreadable. Together, we re-entered the camper. He confirmed the warmth in the sink with his own hand, a slight frown creasing his brow. He took his own set of photographs, his body camera also recording. We discussed the lack of any other evidence, the tidy interior, the absence of any personal effects. Deputy Miller contacted his own dispatch, relaying the details. He requested a tow truck for the camper and initiated a preliminary report. He also ran the license plate and the VIN through his system, confirming the lapsed registration and the lack of any associated missing persons reports. The situation was perplexing. There was no crime scene, no obvious sign of foul play, just an inexplicable detail that suggested a very recent departure. The deputy agreed that the circumstances were unusual enough to warrant further investigation, even if it was just a file that would likely sit dormant. We secured the camper, locking the door with a temporary padlock. The tow truck arrived about an hour later, its powerful engine cutting through the quiet night. The camper was winched onto the flatbed, its faded exterior disappearing into the fog as it was driven away. I completed my report, detailing every observation, every procedural step. The incident was logged in the official logbook, a brief entry about an abandoned vehicle and an unusual interior condition. The sheriff's department opened a file, but without a missing person or any other leads, it was unlikely to progress. No one ever claimed the camper. No one ever reported its owner missing. The file eventually went inactive. I still patrol that stretch of US 101. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy, I think about that night. I remember the quiet hum of my vehicle, the cold air, and the inexplicable warmth in that vacant sink. The image of the damp rag, folded so neatly, sometimes comes back to me. It was a small detail, but it carried a quiet dread that has never quite left me. I was the maintenance foreman, overseeing a stretch of highway along the Oregon coast. It was a cold, damp night in early November, the air thick with ocean fog. The primary radio in my truck had begun to emit a faint, unusual static. My job involved patrolling the more isolated sections of the highway, especially after dark. We looked for fallen debris, checked road conditions, and responded to minor incidents. This particular shift, I was working with a junior crewman, a quiet young man named Mark, who was still learning the routes. Our routine was well established, a rhythm of driving, observing, and reporting back to dispatch. The coastal highway was often quiet at night, especially on the backroads that wound through the forest and along the bluffs. We relied heavily on our radios for communication, both with dispatch and with other crews. The truck was equipped with a primary unit and a smaller, handheld backup, both tuned to the same frequency. The hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio were constant companions in the isolation of the night. We were heading north, just past a series of low bluffs where the road curved sharply away from the ocean. The fog had grown denser, reducing visibility to a few truck lengths. The air felt heavy and still, barely above freezing. The primary radio, which had been intermittently crackling, suddenly went silent. The green power needle remained lit, but there was no carrier signal, just a dead, flat line. I tried the squelch, then the volume, but nothing changed. I reached for the handheld unit, a standard procedure when the main radio acted up. Its screen also showed power, but it too was silent, displaying no active channel. Both radios had gone dead at the same moment, which was highly unusual. I tried cycling the power on both units, but they remained unresponsive. their needles glowing uselessly in the dim cabin light. Just as I was about to pull over and check the antenna connections, a voice cut through the silence. It was brief, clear, and sounded like a standard dispatch call. "Attention all units, lane closure ahead. Static lane, just beyond the curve. Proceed with caution." The voice was calm, almost monotone, and then it was gone. The radios returned to their dead silence, the needles still lit, but without any signal. I looked at Mark, who had clearly heard it too. His eyes were wide in the dim light from the dashboard. "Static lane?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. I had never heard of a road by that name in our sector. I immediately tried to raise dispatch on both radios again, but there was no response. Only the persistent, empty glow of the power indicators. I drove slowly, my headlights cutting through the thick fog. We were approaching the curve where the voice had indicated the closure. I scanned the road ahead for any signs of an incident, flashing lights, cones, or a disabled vehicle. There was nothing. The highway was empty, the asphalt wet and dark. The wind picked up slightly as we rounded the curve, carrying the faint rumble of the surf from the unseen ocean below the bluff. I pulled the truck over to the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires. I grabbed my notepad and flashlight. "Stay here," I told Mark. "I'm going to check the immediate area." The air outside was cold and damp, the fog clinging to my clothes. I walked a short distance ahead, shining my light into the dense fog, looking for any sign of a lane closure, a work crew, or even a simple hazard. There was nothing. The road was clear, the guardrail intact. The only sound was the distant surf and the low hum of the truck engine. I returned to the truck, feeling a growing sense of unease. "Nothing," I reported to Mark. "No closure, no signs, no vehicles." I tried the radios again. Still nothing. The silence was unnerving. I decided to drive further, past where the phantom call had indicated the closure, just to be absolutely certain. We drove for another mile or so, the fog remaining thick, the road empty. There was no other traffic, no other maintenance crews, nothing. It was as if we were the only vehicle on the entire highway. I pulled out my cell phone, but the signal was weak and intermittent in this particular stretch of the coast. I managed to get a single bar, enough to send a brief text message to dispatch, reporting radio failure and a possible phantom call. I knew it would take time for them to receive it and respond. We turned the truck around, heading back towards a section of the highway where I knew cell service was more reliable. The radios remained dead, their needles a constant, mocking green. The silence in the cabin was heavy. Mark kept glancing at the radios, then out into the fog. The incident felt entirely out of place, a clear, specific instruction delivered through dead equipment. It defied any logical explanation. We eventually reached an area with better cell reception, and I was able to make a call to dispatch. I explained the situation, the radio failure, and the phantom lane closure call. The dispatcher confirmed that no such call had been made, and no lane closure had been posted for our sector. They advised me to return to the depot immediately for equipment inspection. Back at the depot, the mechanics checked both radios. They found no fault. Both units powered on and received a clear signal from the main tower. They tested them extensively, running diagnostics, but everything came back normal. The radios were fully functional. I filed a detailed report, documenting the time, location, and the exact phrasing of the phantom call. I included Mark's testimony, which corroborated every detail. The incident was logged as an unexplained radio anomaly. There was no evidence of a malfunction, no other reports of similar interference, and certainly no record of a static lane in our jurisdiction. The state police were notified, but without any physical evidence or a verifiable incident, there was little they could do. The report was filed away, a strange, isolated event with no resolution. The memory of that night still lingers. I still hear the calm, flat voice sometimes, cutting through the silence, announcing a lane closure on a road that does not exist. The image of the glowing dead radio needles and the thick, empty fog beyond the curve remains sharp in my mind.